Welcome to this chess video, everyone. Here we're going to be looking at basically how to survive with your king. And very often you're going to have to actually go into the danger. And this is a very ambitious thing. You know, it takes a lot of calculation, a lot of ambition, and really it's got a lot of similar concepts to actually when you're attacking in chess. So let's see what exactly I'm referring to. I'll show these two examples here. So the very first thing here, this is from an over-the-board game of mine. Now, over the board, I'm not rated quite as high as online. I'm probably more like 1800 over the board. But here in this position, my opponent has just recently captured a pawn here. And so now one of my candidate moves was to, in fact, play knight captures d5, queen captures back, and then play pawn to c3. Now, instead of arrows, I can actually put this on the board. I'll show you what this looks like, something like this. And then it looks like I was winning even more material. Now, you could calculate a little further here. It looks like it's actually very difficult to save this knight because of the pain on the queen. But actually, you can save the queen. You can actually play queen to a5, and then you definitely don't want to take the knight, because then you would blunder your own queen. So you have to be a little careful with that. But as long as you don't take the knight there, white is actually still winning. Now, according to the engine, you can actually play bishop to c4 here. This is completely winning for white, and the play would continue. Now, instead of this, I didn't calculate all of this exactly this deeply. And so back in this position here, I considered, do I want to take this, right? I did see this, and then the queen takes back. I did see c3. But I thought, can I add even more support first? And I got a little ambitious here, and instead I tried castling queenside, because it looks like I can get a rook to d1, add even more pressure to the d file, and it doesn't seem to hurt my position. Unfortunately for me, it does, because after this, there's a new resource. Now, my opponent didn't play it immediately, and so it kind of worked out okay. Best for them was actually trade on c3 and just get rid of the tension on the d file. But instead they played here, and now I tried taking on d5, right? I thought, oh, I castled, everything's fine, but it's a little bit different now. Because now after I play c3, they have a new resource. Now, I did realize that they could capture here, but then I'll capture their knight, and I thought this was winning. Now, here's what I missed. They can actually play their bishop away from c8. Now, you can go here at a deeper depth. I think the engine doesn't call this a mistake, but the engine does prefer bishop b7. Both of them have the same purpose. So the purpose is to clear this square, and so now I'm actually kind of in trouble here, right? But okay, how do we deal with it? Rook coming to c8 is a massive threat, and there's also the queen check down here. Where can my king go? And so this is the position we'd like to look at, our first example here, how you would survive this kind of position. So sometimes you actually have to kind of go into the danger, have to be very bold. And here, when you calculate a bit, you realize that your king actually is best to simply come up to c2. And as crazy as that looks, we are planning to run up the board, and as you'll see, this king is very ambitious, but it's really just the way to survive. Now, of course, many players will look at where's your king safest and then try to run to there. In this case, you could argue that my king looks like he would be safe on f2, but if there's a rook on c8, especially after like the queen here on b3, there might be rook to c2 in some lines, and then you got the problem with the queen and king, and so you might not actually want to be on f2. And so where can our king actually be safest? And this is where the stunning discovery comes to mind. Your king actually wants to go to e4 and possibly start running more to the king side that way. So in the real game, they actually played the check, and then I come up to d3. And this looks really interesting, crazy stuff. They played the check, and now you have to calculate, right? Like my fallback plan, I am up a little material. I can go here and then give up my queen for the rook. It's not ideal. According to the engine, that's losing for me, but that is like the fallback plan if I calculate all the lines and realize that king e4, I get checkmated. But here I actually calculate a bunch and realize, no, I can survive this, and so king e4, right, as ambitious as it looks, sometimes coming up to the center really aggressively is where you need to go. As long as you're not checkmated, you know, you should be okay. So in the game, they actually played this here, when instead of this, the engine actually prefers ideas like rook c8 and slow ideas to try and build their position, and kind of weave a small mating net around my king. Now in this case I got kind of lucky, we both didn't play perfectly here. I thought I should get rid of this bishop, it's a very complicated position, where I took here, they took back, and then I realized that I would have to give up my bishop, and so according to the engine it's actually okay to do so, where you would go king to e3 and then try and find shelter here after they take the bishop. Now, even stronger than this was, of course, to take here really ambitiously, but this just illustrates the concept. Now first, let me show what actually happened, and then I'll go back to show that little improvement. So what actually happened in the real game was king to e3, giving back the bishop, and then coming to f2 where my king is safe. This kind of thing happened, and I later ended up winning the game. But now let's return to this position here and show why this was actually better. So in this, you have to worry about pawn to f5, and passant does not work because the pawn is pinned to the king here. And so in that line, you would have to come back, and then it's pretty much the same thing, where you could give up the bishop, but in between move, there's also this move as well. And I didn't really like that as much, and so in the game, this is why I chose not to capture. Because if we go back here, with this pawn here, we're actually guarding this dark square against the bishop check. And so that's why in the game I chose not to do that. The idea is that you have to be very aggressive and sometimes go into the danger to survive with your king. All my moves up until this with the king running up were actually best, and so sometimes you just have to be very ambitious and just try and escape everything. And now one other little variation in here that's really interesting I'll show is, of course, when I took here, you know, we ended up playing this queen capture, and then I played king e3 as I mentioned. But I would like to show one other small thing which also illustrates the point, which is that if we go back a little bit when they play here, there's a different move that you have to be careful for. And this one I did calculate in the game, but I actually miscalculated. So I realized that f5 is something that you have to be aware of instead of bishop to e6. And so what do you do if f5 check? Well, in this line you have knight captures, bishop captures, king captures, and look at where king going all the way to f5, queen check, and then king g4. And it's almost like you're kind of running up, and then you're going to try and find shelter down. Now the critical move, of course, is this, but then you have bishop g5 blocking with your bishop. And everything is actually holding here. And really, black actually is kind of running out of ideas. Now the last thing they can try maybe is the pawn move, pawn to h6, try and add pressure to this pinned piece, but that move is actually a mistake, and fails to the really strong bishop to d3. And now their queen has to come back, and you don't really have time to capture, because then we can simply trade, and then white is simply up 2 pawns going into this endgame. But okay, very hectic position. The key to this, of course, was this position back here, where I had to realize that to keep my king safe, sometimes you have to aggressively head on up towards the center. In this case here, and not being afraid to necessarily go to f5, as we saw in some of those variations. But if you didn't have this ambitious mindset, then you would have easily gotten checkmated somewhere else along the road. So sometimes the best way to actually defend is to actually kind of aggressively go forward towards the attack. As strange as it looks, sometimes you just have to do that, and calculation is really your friend. But okay, now let's get to the second example, which honestly I think is even more impressive than this game that I had. And so here we have two very strong players from this 2011 game of the European Club Cup. And so in the game, black actually started this really strong attack with knight to e3. Very powerful move. F captures, they trade queens here, and then there was C captures. This is kind of the start of our position, where now white is up 2 points of material because of black's sacrifice here on e3, but black has an amazing attack. First of all, this bishop is extremely strong here, and also this knight has to be careful, because if it ever is captured, there's also a fork on this rook. And so really, just like with my example that we showed earlier, my king is trying to survive. If we are white here, we are just trying to live. And so how can we actually consolidate? Well, very similar to our first example, sometimes you have to go into the danger and start calculating very precisely. Now in this case, there isn't really a good place for our king to come up, but you have to do a little bit of calculation here. And so I'll see if you can find the best move, let you pause the video. Very difficult position. And so I'll give you a few seconds, and then you can see if you can find out this winning sequence that actually holds and lets white's king survive. Okay, so if you didn't find it, don't feel too bad, because the player in the game also didn't find it. Right, 2200 player, and he didn't find this. And so he actually captured here on b5, which is a mistake, and then black took on e4, and later black ended up winning. But in this position, what you can play instead of this is bishop to g2. Which is really complicated stuff, because it looks like it's just breaking the pin here. But there's one critical move that you have to be very careful for, and that's what if black captures here? They just simply remove the defender, and now you can't capture back, because then they'll take on e4 and they'll win back their exchange, while they pick up the knight in the process. And so this is the critical in-between move. There is actually the really strong knight to d6. And if you found all this idea, then congratulations, you very well might become a title player one day. Now here the pressure is still going, right? Black can, capture a pawn, unleash a discovered attack from the bishop. But the best that there really is just repetition. And so you would go here, they can go back, and you just keep shuffling back and forth, and the game should be a draw. Now if black really wants to push for a win, then they can try moving their king over somewhere like here. But in that case, you would grab the very strong bishop. And a sample line could kind of go like this. It's still going to be a draw. Fairly complex, but it's easy enough to see that in this position, White's king, is, at the very least, is not getting checkmated or under a huge attack like we saw earlier. So sometimes you simply have to go into the danger and calculate very precisely. So hopefully your king will survive now with this ambitious idea. Of course, always try and run into safety whenever possible, but sometimes the safest thing to do is actually kind of head into it. Thanks for stopping by for this chess video, everyone. I'll see you in the next chess video.